Why, hello. Hello, it has been ever so long. I didn't mean to take such a long time getting back from Scotland. I did warn you it might take a bit of time. As you can see, I've had my court hair redone. Yes, I like it. I like it. But we are home again, still in my Scottish dress. I just like it. And that and my other dresses are getting refurbished too. So anyway, we are back via the Lake District with the Lyrical Ballads. But before we get started on the Lyrical Ballads, our usual promotionees. So there you go. The book, help you write your great novel. So there's links below for that. And the templates, which I seem to have mislaid, but they're on there too. Now, we are having a look at so many books today. So many different bits and pieces. We're having a look at this, the Lyrical Ballads. Now, the Lyrical Ballads are, well, my dress is sort of an anathema to the authors of the Lyrical Ballads. The Lyrical Ballads were published in 1798 by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, they both contributed to the Lyrical Ballads. It was published anonymously, and it was absolutely shocking. It is really the beginning of the Romantic period for poetry and everything else in England, the opening of this. And you read them from our vantage point where we are post-romantic, well and truly post-romantic, and you look at them and you think, what on earth is so radical about these? I mean, honestly, some of the Wordsworth, not great. Sorry, I'm not a big fan of Wordsworth. Coleridge, like the biggest thing about this particular set of poems, 4 of which were contributed by Coleridge, 19 of which were contributed by Wordsworth. It's a very, very small selection of poems. There's only 23 poems in there. But the biggest things in it are for Coleridge is the great epic, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is the one with the albatross and the ghost ship and all of that. And for Wordsworth, the best poem in it for him is Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. So those are the 2 really big poems that are in this particular selection of poems. But it was very, very radical in its time. And it's very hard for us to actually understand what was so radical about it. So that's what I'd actually like to talk about, because it's a book of poetry. I'm not going to go through these poem by poem. We're not in high school. So to actually understand what makes these poems so radical, we actually have to have a look at this guy, Alexander Pope. Now, Alexander Pope was the preeminent poet of the 18th century, the preeminent neoclassicist poet. I'm not particularly enamored of the neoclassicist period. I'm actually really, really picky when it comes to poetry. I like certain poets over others. I have very strong feelings on some poets. A lot of the romantics give me the shits. I cannot stand Byron. I cannot stand Shelley. A lot of Wordsworth annoys me. A lot of Coleridge annoys me, but I adore Keats. So we will be doing some Keats, but Shelley, oh my God, he shits me. So I do have fairly strong views on what I do and don't like when it comes to poetry. I do like some of the 17th century poems, people like Andrew Marvell or Rochester. That's Wilmot, Earl of Rochester. But to understand why the Romantics in particular were so radical, you actually need to have an idea about Pope. So I'm not going to read a whole load of Pope, but one of the things that neoclassicists are harking back, just as the Renaissance in art is harking back to the ancient world, neoclassicists are harking back to an ancient world. They're also very interested. The neoclassicist period is also the Enlightenment. It is reason, it is logic, and it is very constrained and tight rules about life. It's not, however, that's not to say that it's an unemotional, but it's very pushed into a structure. So think of it as Bach rather than Beethoven. So you have that there, but it's in a structure, and the structure is very, very important. By the time the Romantics are coming along, the French Revolution has happened. That old structure has completely demolished. It's under major, major threat. The French have killed their aristocracy, and the aristocracies around the world are having, and the lives of people are changing rapidly. Okay, it's also the world with the Industrial Revolution in its infancy. It will come fully fledged into the 19th century, but it is starting in its infancy, and this influences things that we see in the Romantic poets, which we'll talk about in a minute. But one thing that the neoclassicists have that it doesn't resemble anything of what the Romantics do with rural life, but the idea of rural life as a form of poetry is seen in neoclassicists as the pastoral. The pastoral is actually an ancient form of poetry. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and neoclassicists use ancient Greek tropes, ancient Greek gods, and use this literary style quite a lot. Now, the form and structure of neoclassicists doesn't mean that they are not, they can be highly, highly satirical. The Rape of the Lock is highly satirical. The Dunciad, both of which are by Pope, are both highly satirical. But Pope he sets the tone for 18th century poetry. And so this is Spring, the First Pastoral. I'm not going to read all of this because I don't have my glasses on. First in the fields I try the Sylvian's strains, nor blush to sport on Windsor's blissful plains. Fair Thames flows gently from thy sacred spring, where on thy banks Sicilian muses sing. So we've got England and Sicily mushed together because this is neoclassicist and he's writing in England for an English audience. Let vernal airs through trembling Ostia's play, and Albion's cliffs resound the rural lay. So you can see you've got, yes, it's about England, but we are pulling it into this classical world, and it's very, very structured. It's highly structured. You've got a very regular rhyme. You've got a very regular meter to this poetry. This is something that the Romantics rebel against, because if we compare that, 4 lines of that, to the opening of Coleridge's The Ancient Mariner. So you heard that Pope, very regular, very rhythmical. This is poetry, but it's very different poetry. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three by thy long grey beard and thy glittering eye. Now wherefore stoppest me? It is a very different style of poetry. It's much more natural. It's not harking back to any mythologized world. It's not harking back to a classical world. It's very much in the here and now. And that is characteristic of the Romantic poems. It's not, although Coleridge and various others will use classical allusions, not so much in this particular volume, but they will use them, but not to the extent that they are used in Popian poetry, the poetry that precedes it. It is not grounded in that. It is not taking its authority from the classical world. In fact, these poems are actively rejecting the classical world. So whereas the Pastoral is a particular style of poem that harks back to the ancient Greeks and creates a rural idyll, these are looking at a very different rural world, though no less idealized. And I will explain that. Where do the Romantics actually come from? Now, you remember when I talked about Johnson? When Johnson went to Scotland, he doesn't care about some rocks or some this or that or the other of the natural world. He's caring about people. And that is entirely appropriate for a man in Johnson's period. He is a neoclassicist. He is right there in the middle of the 18th century. He is not a romantic figure. He is a neoclassical figure. Now, we have looked at some books that are sort of edging towards the romantic end of the neoclassicists, and that is when we looked at sentimentality. Remember when we looked at sentimentality and we found it absolutely nauseous making? Yeah, that. Now, remember when I was talking about that, we were talking about the influence of the French writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that, or his philosophy, whether he believed it or not, I don't know, but he put forward a philosophy that civilization, the civilizing of man and women, lost them some quality of their humanity, so that all this fancy civilized carapace meant that humans had lost their essential nature, and he felt that you got back that essential nature through people who were closer to nature. The poor. He idealized the poor rural workers, and most importantly, because this had a really strong influence as through the 18th century, as Western European powers encountered people in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, in Australia, in New Zealand. This had major impacts on how they viewed the indigenous peoples of the countries that they were gaining increased traffic and contact with. Okay, this doesn't happen, although exoticism happens in Africa and the India and the Middle East, because these cultures are far more technologically advanced than some of the cultures that the late 18th century, early 19th century will come in contact with, the first being obviously the Americas, with indigenous Americans, especially in North America. This idea of the noble savage. So in the Rousseauian concept, these people are more human than the civilized European in some ways, which you see in some early settler writings. In particular, you see it in Watkin Tench in Australia. He is an educated man. He's a Marine. He's a British Marine who is in the initial few years of the Australian Sydney settlement. And he uses the language of the noble savage to discuss the Indigenous people who they encounter. Now, for Indigenous people, this was somewhat of a double bind. So while you may find that educated Europeans are looking in an idealized way at you, they're also bringing things with them like alcohol and wheat and disease and firearms that are going to massively disrupt your lives, that are going to break your society, and that are going to cause you to fall into dependence, especially things like alcohol, which will cause the white people who have brought these things not to take any sort of responsibility for bringing these detrimental things into your world, but will then turn around and look at your degraded position and treat you as an Indigenous person with contempt because of that, because you didn't stand up to their high ideals of you. And this is something that I found reading the Lyrical Ballads, is there is you don't see so much in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is wonderful fantasticness, but you do see it in a lot of Wordsworth stuff. And this is why I don't really like Wordsworth very much. You see it in something like The Female Vagrant. You see it in something like the one about the Native American woman. You see it in all sorts of different stories that he writes. There's a lot of in these little poems. There are a lot of poems in this book that are about an idealized rural life. They're an idealized people who are bravely managing these terrible things that are besetting them. Because this is being used in contrast to the urban poor who are living in extremely unpleasant circumstances with the burgeoning of the Industrial Revolution. So there becomes this tension between this idealized poor but rural and truthful, and the industrialized, corrupted poor. And so in that respect, these poems, for a modern reader, it's very hard to turn off your critical faculties in that way, to read it in the same way that it was read at the time. So what made these poems revolutionary is they were in the voice of the common man. This was basically middle class, wealthy, educated, upper middle class people appropriating the voices of the poor and then using it to idealize them. There are problems with these poems, is what I'm saying. There are real problems with these poems because Romanticism has issues. Basically, what these poems are doing, they are 18th century cottagecore, where you take the pretty stuff and you ignore the the other stuff. So we take pictures in nice flowy dresses and whatnot, but we ignore the fact that living on a farm often involves, sick animals and mud and early mornings and all of these sorts of things that are just unpleasant. But no, we'll just flounce about in pretty things and pick flowers and pretend that everything is like a nice weekend in the country. That sort of thing. That sort of becomes a little bit difficult. It also feels a little exploitative, because all of a sudden these poor people are able to be commented upon because you are their social better, and the readership is their social better, which is what makes me feel like it is a sort of form of 18th century cottagecore. It's an aesthetic. It's something. It's Marie Antoinette playing at being a milkmaid. She lost her head for that. Okay, so it's ironic that there is a level of play acting that did have a tendency to lose people their status in the first place. So I do find that kind of a curious element of the lyrical ballads. Of course, there is no expectation that the lower classes would read these things. These are not made for their consumption. They're not expected to read them. They're certainly not expected to write them. In fact, outside of my period, John Clare was a peasant poet. He actually wrote poetry, and he did come from the lower classes. So he's an interesting person if you want to have a look at, who wrote pastoral, or not pastoral poetry, but rural poetry, who actually came from that world. So his work is a lot less exploitative in terms of using the experiences of the poor for the entertainment of the rich. Ultimately, this book of poetry, this little book of poetry, does see the major break from the neoclassical period into the Romantic period. The neoclassical period was sort of losing its grasp of what poetry did anyway, because neoclassical poetry is long narrative poetry often, like The Rape of the Lock. And long narrative poetry is losing ground against the novel. The novel has been gaining ground the whole of the 18th century. It will become the preeminent narrative device in the 19th century. There will still be some long epic poems, but nowhere near like they used to be. You will never get another Paradise Lost from the 19th century. Epic narrative poems do become something again in the 20th century, but for the 19th century, the novel becomes the preeminent narrative device. And so poetry was actually ripe for a change. It's just that it's not that the change was entirely unproblematic. It's not as though this is problematic, so therefore we're going to change it to this and it's going to be perfect. No, nothing is ever like that. But Romantic poetry is a major, major force. I'm just not going to do any Byron or Shelley or any more Wordsworth or Coleridge. We will do some Keats. We will do some Keats because I do like Keats. But next time I see you, we're coming back with a book. We are coming back with a book. We are coming back with going all the way to the beginning of the 18th century to, I think it's Queen Anne period. It's either Anne or William and Mary period. One of the, like really that early end of the Stuarts, beginning of before Georgian, but you know we're a bit flexible. We're doing Daniel Defoe, and we are going from romantic and idealized to a nice fun slut. We are doing Moll Flanders. So next time, Daniel Defoe and Moll Flanders, because I am not doing Robinson Crusoe. Janice will talk about Robinson Crusoe when she talks about another novel. But we're not doing Robinson Crusoe. I did it at uni. I'm not reading it again. I don't like it. He's an ass. But we are going to do more Flanders. So I look forward to seeing you then. And until then, farewell. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.